Hello, my name is Larry C. Johnson. Good day. And let me remind you again before I proceed with this video to tick the like button if once you've watched the video or whichever part of the video you want to watch, you like what you've heard and decide that you want to indicate that fact. Well, with that, let's proceed. And let me first of all begin a few short comments about the latest actions of the President of the United States, President Donald Trump. Now, President Trump has been busy over the last couple of days. He has engaged in a series of extraordinary personal attacks on two of his former supporters, Representative Tom Massey and Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. He's spoken about them or written about them on Truth Social in, frankly, most uncomplimentary, I would say even offensively insulting terms. And by the way, along the way, he also spoke in a very unfriendly and uncomplimentary and I would say also insulting way about Senator Rand Paul. Anyway, he started out all of those attacks and it was not difficult to work out what was driving a lot of his anger. Clearly, Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Rand Paul have been critical of various things that the president has been doing, and they have been getting increasingly critical of some of his foreign policy positions. But in my opinion, without any real doubt, the thing that really angered President Trump was the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tom Massey, and perhaps especially Tom Massey, who was one of the co-sponsors, were pushing a bill through Congress, which would have required disclosure of the unclassified material in the Jeffrey Epstein case. And President Trump, as for the last few months since May, has said he's against disclosing the material in the Jeffrey Epstein case. He's spoken out, in fact, strongly against doing so. He's referred to the entire Jeffrey Epstein affair as a hoax. He has vehemently denied any personal involvement or wrongdoing in Jeffrey Epstein's affairs. And, well, he has gone back massively, or he went back massively against his previous election commitment to disclose all of the Epstein material, inviting huge amounts of criticism and causing great distress amongst his formerly extremely loyal electoral base. And last week we saw some of the effects of that. There were elections, or 2 weeks ago, I should say, there were elections in the United States, interim elections in various states. The Democrats had runaway wins pretty much across the board. We did a detailed discussion of this entire topic with the U.S. Attorney Robert Barnes, who in my opinion has an unrivaled granular understanding of the domestic politics of the United States, one which is much deeper and far more accurate than my own. He pointed out that the scale of the defeat for Republican candidates in such a set of elections is all but unprecedented in the last 50 or so years. And, well, obviously, economic factors, the worsening cost of living situation in the United States played a key role, but undoubtedly unhappiness about the president's reversal of his position on the Epstein affair played a role too. Well, today the president has reversed himself again, having insulted the primary Republican backers of the bill to disclose unclassified information about Jeffrey Epstein and his operations. Today, the president has essentially capitulated and has said that he's going to support the bill after all. Now, coming after the attacks, the public attacks on Tom Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene, I have to say this straight away. This does not look to me like a graceful acceptance by the president of the inevitable that he's going to lose badly in Congress in a way that essentially obliges him to support this bill. Failing, which he would be heavily defeated, putting himself in an impossible political position. As I said, it was not a graceful retreat from an untenable position, political position. It was a graceless capitulation in the face of an impossible political position. An politically confident president would have called in Tom Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene, told them that he'd made a mistake, that he accepted the mistake, that they were right after all, and would have told them that having reconsidered the matter and listened to what people were saying, including people from across the United States and from his own electoral base, that he had decided to change his stance and would support the bill. But of course, after those personal attacks, he's in no position to do this. And in fact, his comments after his statement that he now supported the bill continued to be graceless. He said that there was nothing in this material that would be at all embarrassing to him personally. By the way, about that, I agree. I think that given all of the investigations, given all the allegations, given all the claims that have been made about Donald Trump ever since he came down the golden lift in Trump Tower in the summer of 2015 and involved himself again in active politics in the United States, I can't imagine that if there was anything really damaging and really serious about him in the Epstein material, that it would not have been disclosed by now. Bear in mind that all of this material has been for a long time in the possession of the FBI, which, from what I can tell, from what anybody can see, for most of the time since 2015, has been intensely hostile to Donald Trump. So I accept his assurance that we're not going to see anything that is going to be especially damaging about him personally in the material. But then he went on to say that the people who would be damaged by it would be the Democrats because they were far more heavily implicated in Epstein and Epstein's affairs than he himself was. Again, I'm perfectly willing to believe that is true. There are all sorts of prominent Democrats one can name who do seem to have been very heavily involved with Epstein, and who, for example, were booked on flights on his private jet. However, Trump saying all of that merely begs the question of why, in that case, he opposed disclosure of this information at all. Now, here I'm going to make a number of points of my own. Firstly, one of the most interesting things that's become clear over the last couple of weeks is that right up until the moment of his final arrest, and despite his earlier conviction, Jeffrey Epstein was continuing to play a very major role, not just in American public life, but in the world of global diplomacy. He was having meetings with the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, Vitaly Churkin. He contacted a prominent member of the Norwegian government in order to set up a meeting with the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in advance of the 2018 Helsinki summit meeting between Putin and Trump, telling the Norwegian minister that he had information about Trump, which the Russians might be interested to know of. Suggestive and interesting comment. It seems that the Russians didn't take him up on that offer. There's no record of him having spoken to any Russian officials in response to this outreach, and certainly there's no record of him having actually met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And in addition to all of that, it seems as if Epstein was also trying to arrange a back channel between the Russian government and the Israeli government, from what I can see, acting mostly on behalf of the Israeli government in connection with the Russian intervention in Syria after 2015. And again, it doesn't seem as if those contacts led anywhere very far. But I do remember that in 2015, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Moscow, and an agreement was indeed reached between the Russians and the Israelis at that time to set up a deconfliction line for their air forces operating in Syria. And, well, I can't help but wonder now, in light of what we've just learned, whether Jeffrey Epstein had any role in that. Probably not. I've seen no evidence that he did, but one is left to wonder. And Jeffrey Epstein did have considerable contacts with, maintained right up until the end, considerable contacts with very prominent members of the American political class. I'm not going to name anybody, but it's there all over the media. Former Treasury Secretary, for example. He also maintained very close contacts with a former Israeli Prime Minister. In this case, I will name him Ehud Barak, who appears at one point to have been Epstein's partner in some kind of business enterprise involving, so far as I can tell, surveillance technology, though I might be completely wrong about that, the latter, in which case, if I am, I apologize. All I am saying is this is extremely active operations by Jeffrey Epstein involving all sorts of very important people, genuinely important people, using Jeffrey Epstein, using contacts and networks that he seemed to have developed in order to influence and shape international relations. And I would say that based on the information we've seen up to now, which admittedly is probably only a microscopic fraction of the total, Epstein's major interests appear to have been in the world of international diplomacy rather than anything else. Perhaps just possibly centering on the Middle East. Anyway, there we are. We have all of this information. And of course, to me, that again begs the underlying unanswered question about Jeffrey Epstein, which is why was this single individual playing such a huge and active role in international affairs? Why was he maintaining contacts, as we all know, with the brother of the man who is now King of England, King of Great Britain? Why was he so close to prominent British politicians, or at least to one of them, Peter Mandelson, recently, until very recently, Britain's ambassador to Washington, former minister in Tony Blair's governments, formerly a commissioner at the European Commission in Brussels, and an individual who is always part of British power, the British power system, even when he's never really been in office, at least up to now. Anyway, how is it? Why were all of these people giving so much of their time and energy to conversing and corresponding and arranging meetings and having messages with Jeffrey Epstein? Why did Norwegian ministers want to have interactions with him? Why did Russian ambassadors want to have interaction with him too? Why did former Israeli prime ministers want to have interaction with him also? Now, I am, of course, very well aware of the speculations that Epstein was involved in intelligence and that he was an intelligence agent of one particular country. I've seen so far no proof of that. And I have to say this, though, it is a possibility that might explain lots of things. But I have to say, it seems to me that the range of his contacts go beyond that and beg further questions. Bear in mind a point I have made already in many programs, that Jeffrey Epstein, whilst obviously an immensely rich man by the standards of most of humanity, by comparison with the billionaire class that is such a major player in society and economics and politics in the West today, was not even an especially rich man. And I've already pointed out that the scale of his lifestyle, his apartment on the Avenue Foch in Paris, and in fact, he owned the entire apartment building in that incredibly expensive street, which I know very well, by the way. His ranch in the United States, his mansion in New York, the 2 Caribbean islands he owned, his private jet, the manner and way in which he spent his money, all of that appears to me to have exceeded the potential of his known fortune. And there's never been a real coherent explanation as to how that fortune ever came about in the first place. So a man of extraordinary mystery in many ways, and the mystery just goes on growing. At least that is what I think. And I'm going to say this. People should not have over high expectations of this bill, because if, and even if it is eventually translated into law, which presumably it will be, the only information that we will be entitled to see is information which is currently unclassified. I'm going to make a guess that that represents only a small fraction of the total, which is spread out over security services, intelligence agencies, various parts of the U.S. government bureaucracy, parts of the bureaucracies of many countries. All of that information will continue to be classified also. And bear in mind, just to repeat again, that these activities that Epstein was involved in continued after his conviction and seemed to have been unaffected in any way by it. All of the people who he was interacting with must have known about this conviction, but it doesn't seem to have concerned them or affected them in the ways that they interacted with Epstein at all. Now, it would in theory be possible to obtain answers to all of these mysteries, all of these questions. But that obviously cannot happen unless the President of the United States himself is fully on board. Given how graceless Donald Trump's response to his forced reversal on the Massey bill has been, given the fact that he opposed the Massey bill in the first place and has spoken about the whole Epstein affair as a hoax, I can't help but think that he has no intention at all of taking this matter any further in any way, and that he will resist all demands which are bound to be made for further declassification of these papers. Anyway, there we go. A very complex, very strange affair. One, as I said, which throws up more and more questions, at least for me, all the time. One which perhaps one day full answers will be provided, though I wonder whether that will happen, being realistic about it. In my lifetime, anyway. There it is now, going on from this. We've also had other steps and statements by the president himself. He has again floated the possibility of an economic blockade on Russia. He's now talking again about Congress passing legislation to sanction countries that continue to have economic dealings with Russia. This looks like an attempt to revive the Lindsey Graham-Richard Blumenthal bill of the summer, the one which threatened countries which buy Russian oil with 500% tariffs. And this might, by the way, be connected with the expected decision from the Supreme Court of the United States, which it seems will say that the president's existing tariffs are unconstitutional. Lindsey Graham has tried to sell his bill to Trump as a way to make tariffs constitutional on the basis that any tariffs imposed by the president on countries which trade with Russia would be constitutional since they have been authorized by Congress. And one can always find some evidence that any particular country is indeed engaging in trading with Russia. So it may be that, but again, it is not going to help the president's overall and underlying position because, of course, what Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal told and the hardliners in Congress, and by the way, the hardliners in the Treasury Department who want to increase and escalate their sanctions and who now see tariffs as a nice sanctions tool which they can deploy, what they are currently targeting most of all is Russia's energy exports. And well, a number of things immediately come to mind as a result of all of this, because the country that is currently buying the largest amount of energy from Russia and which is entering into COAG agreements with Russia on energy matters is, of course, China. Now, the Russians have now begun work on Power of Siberia too. They have started the various studies and preparations for the construction of Power of Siberia too. As the Financial Times has conceded, that in itself requires a heavy investment in funds, and the Russians would not be doing this if they were not confident that Power of Siberia 2 would indeed be built. And, the Financial Times pretends that China has not agreed to Power of Siberia 2, despite a clear agreement between Putin and Xi Jinping over the course of Putin's visit to China in August to move forward with Power of Siberia 2. Anyway, the Financial Times pretends that this is still unresolved, even though, of course, it is resolved, and there is a joint Chinese-Russian commitment to build Power of Siberia 2. And the Russians, of course, continue to supply oil to China, and oil continues to be pumped to China through Power of Siberia, one which is already in operation and by ship, and I have no doubt that continues, despite various claims in some parts of the media that it has stopped. I see no evidence that it has stopped, and I don't believe that it has stopped, not in any way. Anyway, so the United States has already fought a succession of economic skirmishes with China over the course of this year. It launched an economic attack on China in the form of massive tariffs in April. It found itself catapulted into doing exactly the same thing after the Treasury Department in September went back on a tariff truce that the U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent had negotiated with China in September by massively increasing the number of Chinese companies that were subject to U.S. sanctions, did so by orders of magnitude, something like 20-fold in step the U.S. has been forced to reverse. And of course, all of that failed because China responded. They responded by taking steps relating to rare earths and the United States after a recent meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping in Singapore says that the Chinese have agreed to soften these regulations on rare earths. But a slew of articles which have appeared in the media now says that China has not, in fact, reversed or relaxed or toned down in any significant and effective way. It's tighter regulations on rare earths, and they remain in place and are capable of being activated at any time. And of course, it's not just rare earths. There continues to be a crisis over the Nextedia company, which produced middle and low-end chips, many of them used in the auto industries in Europe and the United States. The Dutch government, under pressure from the United States, took control of Nextedia's Dutch headquarters, ousting the Chinese appointed CEO of the company, who is a Chinese national, and putting a Dutch national handpicked by the Dutch government in his place. That has led to a rupture between Expedia Netherlands and an Expedia China. The Dutch and the Europeans and the Americans have discovered that without the cooperation of the Chinese partner, Nextea chips cannot be finished and are therefore unavailable to the car industry. And again, there were reports about a week ago that the Chinese were relaxing their restrictions on these chips. And again, this has proved to be untrue. In fact, chip shortages relating to Nexidia continue to cause growing pressure on the German and American and other European car industries. So all of this is happening, and here we have the President of the United States and some people in Congress threatening further sanctions against China because it might be continuing to import Russian oil and, in fact, might be continuing to trade with Russia altogether. Now, to repeat again, there is absolutely no possibility that China is going to sacrifice its long-term economic relations with Russia because that is what the United States wants. My very good friend Brian Bledich has recently posted on X a post about certain commentaries in the United States which make it perfectly clear that the U.S. military are still working on their plan, which goes back all the way to the Obama administration to impose a sea blockade on China to choke off imports. Vital imports for China of food and energy and raw materials. And if only for that reason, given that Russia is in a position to break that kind of blockade, it has a continuous border with China. It is also in a position to supply goods to China by pipeline and ship and by rail and by road. And the seas, China's seas and Russia's seas, are contiguous with each other. And of course, Russia is perhaps the most blessed country in the world in terms of energy and raw materials, and indeed food as well. The Chinese are absolutely not going to jeopardize or sacrifice a long-term relationship with Russia, which is vital for their long-term security. Doing such a thing would increase China's vulnerability and would expose China to precisely this very sea blockade that the Americans have been so busy working on. So given that that is so, the Chinese will not sacrifice their relationship with Russia. And if this bill that the president is talking about were to come into force, and if the president were indeed to enforce it, he would again find that both he and the United States had been catapulted all the way back into an economic war with China, in which China holds all the high cards. It can stop exports of rare earths.